Hello, welcome to this video on crisis intervention in support work. My name's Nathan Loynes. I'm the Programme Manager on the degree programme for Child and Family Studies at the University of Leeds. Rather than place my references at the end of the video, I've placed them at the start so you don't have to wade all the way through it again if you want to dig around a little deeper and consult some of the sources in more detail. Our learning objectives today are to consider the contextual factors impacting on crisis intervention, to understand the general model and the three phases of crises, and to identify situations where crisis intervention is most useful, and recognise key theory and skills alongside underpinning ethical considerations in undertaking crisis intervention. Defining crisis. A crisis is characterized by extraordinary challenge, difficulty and uncertainty, challenging one's ability to cope at a basic level of human functioning. A breakdown. Factors constituting a crisis are subjective and vary among individuals. The emotional, practical and physical impact defines the event, evoking powerful feelings even upon recall. Let's explore the definitional concept of crisis in a little more detail. Each individual experiences crises as part of life's challenges. Debate exists in social work literature as to the definition of a crisis, with generic explanations. Popular definitions may not fully capture the unique meaning and experience of a crisis situation for individuals and families. Crisis manifests in various ways beyond extreme outward emotional responses. Anger, overwhelm and depression may be expressed differently or impossible to articulate in extreme situations. Understanding the analogy of coping with loss and grief helps predict the path of a crisis. So let's have a look at some of those theoretical underpinnings. Three fundamental and interconnected theoretical principles underpin the understanding of crisis situations. These principles are essential in defining what constitutes a crisis situation. Understanding these principles is crucial for effective crisis intervention in support work. So, without further ado, we need to understand crisis dynamics. Crisis intervention involves understanding the dynamics of crisis situations. Assessment frameworks emphasize the importance of considering context alongside the intervention. Effective crisis intervention requires a holistic approach to address individual needs. So we need a contextual awareness, recognizing socio-environmental factors and interpersonal challenges. Also the applicability, identifying situations where crisis intervention is the most suitable approach or something else as an alternative. Model comprehension, understanding the general model and the three phases of crisis, and we'll come on to those shortly. The skill set and ethics, recognizing key skills and ethical considerations essential in crisis intervention. When people are in crises, they're naturally quite vulnerable, and it's important that we deal with those vulnerabilities ethically and sensitively. Kaplan 1965 describes precipitating hazardous events as stressors leading up to crisis situations, antecedents, if you like. Crises are often triggered by stressors that accumulate over time, leading to a breaking point, the straw that breaks the camel's back. Understanding the context of crises is vital in determining intervention strategies, focusing on moving forward rather than dwelling on the why. Research in crises and trauma intervention often comes from the psychological and mental health communities. Research on individual crises responses focuses on assessing crises and validating measurement tools. Immediate practical social and emotional support should be offered after a traumatic event, claims Bisson. So let's return to a familiar concept, the cycle of grief. The cycle of grief model by Kubler-Ross 1969 comprises of 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. The cycle of grief model is often evoked in understanding reactions to sudden loss and change. So it's not necessarily a death or bereavement, but loss and change. These stages may not occur sequentially, but understanding their emotional and physical impact is crucial in crisis intervention. Successful navigation through these stages equips individuals with the self-efficacy and ability to cope in future crises. Crisis often entails emotional overwhelm, disrupting thought processes, sleep patterns, and appetite. Navigating crisis stages successfully fosters self-efficacy and competence in coping with future challenges. Effective intervention requires an understanding of emotional and physical impacts. We have to have emotional intelligence, guiding appropriate support and recommending intervention strategies. Crisis is a subjective experience, and intervention decisions should be based on the unique story of the individual and family. What might be a crisis to one person is not necessarily a crisis to another. Intervention should be informed by the meaning and reality of the situation as experienced and communicated by the client. Life cycle events often trigger crises, necessitating accommodation and readjustment to the major life changes. We also have to be aware of how stress affects individuals. Stress affects all individuals and can be both disabling but also stimulating and productive. Managing stress is influenced by our primary socialization experiences, how we grew up, how we saw others model their response to stress. While stress can be intense and persistent, crisis is characterized by acute psychological and physical overwhelm. People can still function on a day-to-day basis with a high level of stress, but not when in crisis. Crisis involves intense psychological and physical overwhelm, which often lasts 4 to 6 weeks, according to Kaplan. How individuals cope during this intense period largely determines future adaptation to similar situations. Crisis management involves finding unique coping mechanisms and support systems to navigate these overwhelming challenges. Individuals may feel overwhelming inadequacy and failure at the point of our intervention. Many believe that they are responsible for the crisis, necessitating reassurance and validation of their efforts and perceptions. Maladaptive coping mechanisms can often be reframed as positive attempts to restore balance or normality. So it's important to be able to reassure and get people to think about the situation they're in and the skills that they have in different and more strength-based and empowering ways. In further getting to know individuals in our assessment at the point of the crisis, Parker emphasises the importance of a biographical understanding in crisis intervention. Intervention decisions should prioritise the client's perspective and lived experience of the crisis situation. How do they understand things? Life cycle events play a significant role in crisis intervention, requiring familiarity with the human life cycles and its associated challenges. So, as well as understanding the individual and how the individual perceives their crisis situation, we need to understand the type of things that people deal with typically at what stage they are in their life. So how can we do this? Life cycle events mark significant developmental stages and periods of readjustment, often triggering crises. For example, when children leave home or when divorce occurs. Familiarity with the human life cycle is essential in crisis intervention, allowing practitioners to understand and address the unique challenges individuals face at different stages in their lives. Effective crisis intervention requires a holistic understanding of the client's life experience and the context of the crisis situation. In other words, we have to find out about what's happening to the client. We do that by attending to the person's story. It is vital to attend to the person's story in their own words and world for effective intervention. We can use active listening techniques, seek out clarifications about what's happening. Appreciating the psychodynamic, psychosocial, and systems theory is essential in understanding, addressing individual narratives. That is, understanding the person in their social context. So let's have a look at that in more detail, systems theory and its relationship to crisis intervention. Crises occur within distinct and complex environments, ecologies, social systems. This necessitates that we have an understanding of systems theory. Systems theory informs the understanding of the impact and functions of the various systems central to the client, the individual, the family. The progression and resolution of crises are linked to the person's functioning before the crisis event. So we need to understand what is happening within the individual's systems, social systems, and where the various stresses are occurring, because the solution is likely to exist within that system too. Now, although we tend to be focusing on the individual as well as their social system, we need to also be aware of how broader structural social inequalities can impact on an individual. We can't solely put responsibility for an individual losing it, having a breakdown on their individual or immediate family system's coping mechanisms. From an ethical standpoint, we have to have a look at some of these more external structural factors. Family support practice often involves addressing issues of poverty and exclusion among service users. Identifying supports in the person's networks, community, and family are crucial in crisis intervention. The focus should be on action and support rather than delving into historical detail, emphasizing the where and how in moving forward. So it's not therapeutic as such, but looking at a process of mobilizing the strengths and the resources that the individual has access to within their socio-economic context, and acknowledging that there will be limitations to those things as a result of their structural social economic context. So in enabling this to happen, we have to have a cultural awareness. An awareness of environment and culture is critical. Crisis experiences are bound by cultural norms and values influencing how crises manifests. For example, is it okay within a particular culture to talk about being under pressure? Is that influenced by gender, race, and other things? Cultural competent intervention requires knowledge of how individual context and culture influence crises presentation. We need to be culturally competent practitioners when involved in crisis intervention, so says Sullivan et al. Culturally competent crisis intervention requires a contextual approach to understanding the client in their crisis. Factors such as race, ethnicity, intersect with other factors such as gender, socioeconomic class, immigration status, history, and oppression. We know these as intersectionalities. These factors influence our values. These factors influence the values of the service user, their perception, their help-seeking behaviours, their exposure to stress, their coping capacities, and indeed the individual's perception of are they actually in crisis. So a person can be behaving in a very chaotic crisis manner without actually being aware themselves that they are in crisis. When I chose this image of the moon, I was influenced by the idea of phases, but actually I wished I'd have chosen a mirror for this image, and you'll see why in a moment. The crisis process can be observed in three broadly overlapping phases: the beginning, the action, and the termination. These phases provide a template for understanding and intervening in crisis interventions. And here's the mirror. The framework for undertaking crisis intervention adapts the beginning, action, and termination phases as a basis for crisis intervention. In other words, how we intervene should follow that beginning, making an action, and then terminating the crisis intervention. One of the features of crisis intervention, and probably in contrast to a lot of participatory and voluntary family support practice, is its more directive nature. Crisis intervention is one of the most directive interventions in support work practice. Practitioners play an active guiding role, particularly in the initial stages of crisis intervention. Adhering to a structured, reflective process is essential to avoid creating overly dependent relationships and to promote helpful interventions. In other words, to be ethical in our practice. So while we're being directive, we have to be mindful that we're being directive in the client's best interest. And often clients will be explicitly and implicitly asking us to be directive because they've lost the capacity to self-direct in some cases. A key task within crisis intervention is to determine whether an individual is presenting to us in psychological distress or in the more serious crisis state. Psychological distress and crisis are distinct, with crisis characterized by an overwhelming inhibition in being able to meet one's basic needs. Stress, while pervasive, common, is not crisis. Crisis is indicated by acute psychological and often physical overwhelm, typically short-term in nature. Individuals experiencing psychological distress may lack insight into their ability to meet their needs, posing risks to themselves and others. Crisis is an upset in a continuing steady state. In other words, crisis is overwhelming and unabating. A person in crisis may have been in that crisis for a number of days, a number of weeks, as Kaplan says, between 4 and 6 weeks. Stress tends to ebb and flow depending on the situation. Crisis is pervasive. In crisis intervention, understanding the level of overwhelm is essential in providing the appropriate support and intervention. We don't want to go off at the deep end. Another key understanding for practitioners is an understanding of the role of early intervention in trauma. The early presentation of post-traumatic symptoms predicts longer-term outcomes. Timely interventions and referrals are crucial in addressing ongoing needs arising from traumatic events. Assessment skills and awareness of maladaptive coping in the context of the trauma are vital for support work practice. So it's been acute to being able to spot these kind of signs and also acting quickly. Crisis intervention does not offer a single approach to intervening with individuals. You've got to work with the individual, where they're at, the nature of the crisis, and the type of support and resources that they have. Individual coping mechanisms in crisis may not be accurately reflecting a person's general coping ability. So how a person responds in crisis is not how a person might respond in dealing with day-to-day stresses. Acknowledgement of the individual's overwhelm is crucial in crisis intervention. As well as understanding how the individual is feeling about themselves, we have to be able to assess the risk that they pose behaviourally to themselves and others. Assessment of risk for self-harm or harm to others is crucial in crisis intervention. See Roberts 2005 for more on this. Workers must sensitively explore thoughts of self-harm or harm to others, providing an opportunity for clients to articulate their feelings and thoughts. This is a tricky job. Approaching risk assessment confidently and sensitively is essential for the safety and well-being of the client and others. So is a person using words dramatically, or is there something about the nature of their overwhelm that leads you to believe that they may harm themselves or harm others? And again, see more on Roberts's intervention model on crisis of how we might approach that level of harm. So far, I've presented some of the more severe and negative aspects around crises, but actually a crisis situation can serve as a message to individuals that something in their life needs to change, and that can be an opportunity for change and growth. Beckett likens a crisis to the metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly, symbolizing disintegration and the subsequent regeneration of a new potential and a new life. The crisis experience can lead to transformative learning and growth. As well as being highly mindful to the crisis state of others, effective crisis work requires that we take good care of ourselves. Practitioners must be mindful of the emotional impact of working with individuals in crisis and distress. Effective practitioners prioritize their self-care, practicing self-compassion and taking personal responsibility for their well-being. Open and honest review and reflection with oneself, clients and supervisors are crucial in mitigating the potential for oppression and promoting ethical practice. In summary, the core components of crisis intervention. Crises are time-limited experiences beyond an individual's coping capacity. Reassurance and attending to the individual's subjective experience are crucial on the part of practitioners. Solution-focused techniques and goal setting are important for shifting the mindset in looking forward. What are the key principles of crisis intervention? Crisis intervention is an approach to intervening assessed by a worker in partnership with the client. It is proven and established for individuals, groups, or communities affected by trauma. Listening, questioning, reframing, and reassurance are essential skills for practitioners to use. Assessment of suicidal ideation and harm to others may be necessary, but not always. Pay attention to the sometimes dramatic use of language. So here are my final take-home points. Crisis intervention is active, time-limited, and task-focused. Follow-up support is essential within 4 to 6 weeks, which may include further therapeutic or meaning-making interventions. You can look at Robert and Otten's for more of the emphasized importance on this. The end is rooted in the beginning, with a focus addressing underlying issues. So there is a beginning, the action that we take, and then finally the termination to the crisis intervention process. Thanks for listening today.